Inside Ohio State Penitentiary, America's forgotten prison of fire, riots, and solitary confinement. The weight of silence. There's a particular kind of quiet that exists only in places built to hold human despair. It's not peaceful. It's not empty. It's the sound of breathing compressed by concrete, of footsteps that echo two long down corridors painted in colors meant to calm, but instead flatten the spirit. It's the rustle of cloth against metal, the distant clang of a door that's been closing for over a century, and the low hum of fluorescent lights that never sleep. This is the Ohio State Penitentiary, not the famous one in Mansfield that tourists visit now, with its Gothic towers and Hollywood history. This is the other one, the one that stayed open long after it should have closed, the one that held men the state wanted forgotten, the one where the fire started in 1930, where riots erupted in the dead of winter, where solitary confinement wasn't punishment. It was architecture. Walk to the front gates, past the limestone walls built by convict labor in 1834, and you're stepping into a machine designed for one purpose: containment, not rehabilitation, not redemption. Containment. The men who entered here didn't just lose their freedom. They lost their names. Inside these walls, you were a number stitched to your chest, a file in a cabinet. A body counted twice a day to make sure you were still breathing. The state didn't care if you learned a trade, or found God, or wrote letters home. It cared that you stayed put. Before we go any further, drop your location in the comments. It's how this community stays connected. If this kind of true story resonates with you, like the video, subscribe, turn on notifications, and share it with someone who won't look at prisons the same way again. Because what happened inside the Ohio State Penitentiary isn't ancient history. It's a blueprint, a warning, a mirror held up to a system that still operates on the same broken assumptions about punishment, power, and what happens when you lock human beings in cages and pretend they stop being human. The prison opened in 1834, back when punishment meant public whipping and exile to the frontier. Ohio was still raw land then, carved out of the Northwest Territory, filling up with farmers and preachers and merchants who wanted law and order without the mess of actually dealing with criminals. So they built a penitentiary on the banks of the Scioto River in Columbus, right in the heart of the new state capital. The design was radical for its time. 7 tiers of cells stacked in a wagon wheel formation, all radiating from a central rotunda, where a single guard could stand and see down every corridor at once. It was called the Pennsylvania system. Total isolation, total silence, total control. Inmates were locked in their cells 23 hours a day. They ate alone. They worked alone. They were forbidden from speaking, singing, or making noise of any kind. The theory was simple. If you stripped away all human contact, the criminal would turn inward, confront his sins, and emerge reformed. The reality was madness. Men went deaf from the silence. They carved messages into the stone with their fingernails. They spoke to the walls because the walls were the only things that wouldn't report them for breaking the rules. Some of them never spoke again, even after they were released. Their minds had learned that language was dangerous. By the 1850s, the Ohio State Penitentiary was already overcrowded. Cells built for one man held 2, then 3. The isolation system collapsed. Inmates were allowed to work together in the prison shops, making shoes, sewing uniforms, breaking rocks in the quarry. But the silence rule remained. You could stand shoulder to shoulder with another man for 10 hours a day and never say a word. That silence created its own language. A cough meant danger. A whistle meant the guard were coming. A knock on the cell wall, 2 short and 1 long, meant someone had died in the night. And men died often. The prison had no ventilation, no running water in the cells, no heat in the winter. Tuberculosis spread like fog. Cholera outbreaks emptied entire tiers. In the summer of 1849, a typhoid epidemic killed 43 men in 2 weeks. The bodies were buried in unmarked graves behind the prison walls, in a plot the inmates called the Forgotten Field. The state didn't investigate. It didn't reform. It just kept sending more men. By 1900, the Ohio State Penitentiary was a relic, a crumbling monument to a punishment philosophy that had been abandoned everywhere else. But Ohio didn't tear it down. Instead, it expanded. New cell blocks were added, modern for their time, with electric lights and iron bars instead of wooden doors. The old isolation wing was converted into solitary confinement, the hole, as the inmates called it. The hole was where you went if you fought back, if you spoke out of turn, if you looked at a guard the wrong way. It was a row of stone cells, each one 6 feet by 8 feet, with no windows, no light, and a steel door that sealed you in total darkness. You were fed once a day through a slot in the door, bread and water, sometimes just water. Men stayed in the hole for weeks, months, some for years. There are documented cases of inmates entering solitary confinement sane and leaving broken, unable to recognize their own faces in a mirror, unable to remember why they'd been sent there in the first place. The darkness didn't just take your sight. It took your sense of time, your sense of self. One guard, interviewed in 1925, described it this way. You put a man in the hole long enough, he stops being a man. He becomes something else. Something that don't talk, don't think, just breathes. The state called it discipline. The inmates called it death without dying. And the men who survived it, the ones who came out of the hole still capable of speech, still capable of rage, those were the ones who burned the prison down. The architecture of control. To understand what happened inside the Ohio State Penitentiary, you have to understand how it was designed to break you before you even arrived. The intake process was theatrical, deliberate. It was meant to strip away every piece of identity you brought with you through those gates. You came in shackled, hands cuffed to a chain around your waist, ankles bound just loose enough to shuffle forward. The wagon or prison bus pulled into the receiving yard, and you stepped out into a space designed to make you feel small. The walls rose 40 feet on every side. Guard towers loomed at each corner, rifles visible against the sky. You were led into the processing hall, a long room with concrete floors and metal benches bolted to the wall. The air smelled like lye soap and sweat. You sat with the other new arrivals, some of them kids, barely 18, sent up for stealing a car or selling bootleg whiskey. Some of them were hardened repeaters, men who'd done time in 3 states and knew the routine by heart. A corrections officer called your name. Not the name your mother gave you. Your legal name, the one on the court documents. You stood. You walked to the desk. The officer behind it didn't look up. He asked your age, your crime, your sentence. He wrote it all down in a ledger, the same ledger that had been filled out for 100 years, with names stacked on top of names, lives reduced to ink and numbers. Then came the photograph. Front view, side view. Hold the placard with your new number. Don't smile. Don't look away. The camera flash left spots in your vision, and by the time you blinked them away, you were already someone else. They took your clothes. Everything. Shoes, shirt, belt, whatever you had in your pockets. If you had a wedding ring, they took that too. It all went into a brown paper bag with your number written on it in black marker. You were told you'd get it back when you were released. Most men never saw that bag again. You stood naked in a line with the other new arrivals. A guard walked down the row with a clipboard, checking for scars, tattoos, marks that might identify you if you tried to escape. He noted everything. A burn on your left shoulder, a knife scar across your ribs, the name of a woman tattooed on your forearm in faded blue ink. Then you were sent to the showers, not the kind you take at home. Industrial showers, no stalls, just a row of nozzles on a tile wall. The water was freezing or scalding, never in between. You scrubbed with a bar of soap that smelled like kerosene. A guard stood watch to make sure you didn't take too long. When you stepped out, there was a uniform waiting. Gray trousers, gray shirt, both stamped with your number. If the pants were too short or the shirt too tight, you didn't complain. Complaining marked you. They handed you a bedroll, a thin mattress, a wool blanket, a pillowcase with no pillow. You followed the guard to the main corridor, past cells where men stood at the bars and watched you walk by. Some of them said nothing. Some of them whispered. You didn't know if they were warning you or sizing you up. Your cell was waiting. 6 feet wide, 8 feet deep, a steel bunk bolted to the wall, a metal toilet with no seat, a sink that dripped, one small window, too high to see out of, covered with bars and wire mesh. The door was solid iron with a slot for food trays, and a small window at eye level, so the guards could check on you without opening the door. The guard unlocked it. You stepped inside. The door clanged shut behind you, and the sound echoed down the tier like a bell tolling. That sound was the same sound every man heard on his first day. It was a sound that told you there was no going back, no appeal, no second chance. You were inside now, and inside was a country with its own laws. The official rules were posted on the wall of every tier. No fighting, no stealing, no disrespecting officers, no contraband. Violators would be disciplined according to the severity of the offense. But those weren't the real rules. The real rules were unwritten. They were passed down inmate to inmate, whispered in the yard, carved into the underside of tables in the mess hall. And if you didn't learn them fast, you didn't survive. Rule 1, keep your head down. Don't make eye contact with anyone unless you're ready to back it up. Rule 2, never take anything that isn't offered. A piece of bread off someone's tray. A cigarette left on a bench. If you take it, you owe. Rule 3, don't talk to the guards unless you have to. And when you do, don't volunteer information. The inmates who talked too much disappeared into the hole or ended up with a shiv in the shower. Rule 4, find your people. In the Ohio State Penitentiary, you couldn't survive alone. You needed a crew, a group of men who watched your back, because you watched theirs. It didn't matter if you liked them. It mattered that you needed them. And Rule 5, the one that mattered most, never show weakness. Weakness was blood in the water. Weakness meant you were prey. Cry in your cell at night, and someone 2 doors down would hear it. Flinch when a man got too close, and the whole tier would know by breakfast. Show fear, and the predators would circle. Because the Ohio State Penitentiary wasn't just a building. It was an ecosystem. At the top were the guards, the ones with the keys and the clubs and the authority to send you to solitary for any reason or no reason at all. Below them were the trustees, inmates who'd earned privileges by cooperating, snitching, or simply surviving long enough to be useful. Then came the general population, the men who worked in the laundry, the kitchen, the license plate factory. They had routines. They had crews. They had a fragile kind of stability. And at the bottom were the new arrivals, the young ones, the ones who didn't know the rules yet. They were the ones who got tested first. Testing happened fast. Maybe it was someone bumping into you in the chow line and waiting to see if you'd push back. Maybe it was a man asking to borrow something you didn't have and seeing if you'd admit weakness. Maybe it was a fight that broke out over nothing, just to see how you'd react. If you fought, you earned respect. Even if you lost, even if you got your nose broken or your ribs cracked, you showed you wouldn't fold. And that mattered. If you didn't fight, if you backed down or ran to the guard for protection, you were marked. Marked men didn't last long. They got extorted. They got beaten. They got worse. The guards knew all of this. They watched it happen. Some of them didn't care as long as it didn't spill over into a riot. Some of them encouraged it. Because a prison where the inmates were busy fighting each other was a prison that didn't fight the guards. But some of the guards were just as dangerous as the inmates. There were men who wore the uniform because they wanted power over other men. Men who used their position to humiliate, to hurt, to control. They'd withhold food. They'd shut off water to a tier in the middle of summer. They'd walk past a cell where an inmate was sick or dying and do nothing because doing nothing was easier. And then there were the guards who looked away, the ones who took bribes. A carton of cigarettes to ignore a fight, a cut of the profits from the gambling ring that ran out of the print shop, a favor from an inmate in exchange for smuggling in a bottle of whiskey or a few pills. Corruption wasn't the exception. It was the oil that kept the machine running. Because the Ohio State Penitentiary was never designed to rehabilitate. It was designed to warehouse, to hold men until their time was up, and then release them back into the world no better, and often worse, than when they came in. The daily routine was the same, year after year, decade after decade. You woke at 5:30 when the bell rang. You stood at your cell door for count. A guard walked the tier, checking faces against a list, making sure no one had died in the night or tunneled through the wall. At 6, the doors opened. You had 10 minutes to use the toilet, wash your face, make your bunk. Then you lined up for breakfast. The mess hall was the most dangerous room in the prison. 200 men packed into a space meant for half that. All of them hungry, all of them angry, all of them carrying tension like a coiled spring. Fights broke out over nothing. A look, a comment, someone sitting in the wrong seat. You ate fast. Watery oatmeal, bread, coffee that tasted like rust. You kept your eyes on your tray and your back to the wall. If you could, then you went to work. If you were assigned to the laundry, you spent 8 hours feeding sheets into industrial presses that hissed steam and could take your hand off if you weren't careful. If you were in the license plate factory, you stamped metal until your shoulders ached. If you were in the quarry, you broke rocks in the sun or the snow, depending on the season. The work was hard. The pay was pennies. And it didn't matter if you were sick or hurt or exhausted. You worked or you went to the hole. Lunch was the same as breakfast. Dinner was the same as lunch. After dinner, you had an hour in the yard if the weather was good, and the guards felt like letting you out. The yard was a rectangle of cracked concrete, surrounded by walls. No grass, no trees, just space to walk in circles or sit on a bench and smoke if you had cigarettes. That hour was when deals were made, when debts were settled, when alliances formed and broke. At 8 o'clock, the bell rang again. You went back to your cell. The door locked, and you sat in the silence until you fell asleep or the sun came up, whichever came first. Day after day after day. Some men did this for a year, some for 5, some for 20, and some never left. The fire that changed nothing. April 21st, 1930. The date doesn't appear in most history books. It's not taught in schools. But if you walk through the Ohio State archives and pull the right file, you'll find a stack of photographs that tell a story the state tried to bury. Blackened cells, melted iron bars, bodies laid out in rows on the prison lawn, covered with white sheets that the wind kept pulling back. The Great Ohio Penitentiary fire killed 322 men in less than 6 hours. It remains one of the deadliest prison fires in American history, and it started because of a single match. The official report would later call it an accident, a candle knocked over in the scaffolding of a construction project, an unfortunate tragedy. No one to blame, but the inmates who survived told a different story. They said the fire was set on purpose, that it started in the old West Cell Block, the one that was scheduled for demolition but was still housing overflow prisoners because the new wing wasn't finished yet. They said it started in a pile of oily rags that had been sitting there for weeks, rags the maintenance crew had been told to remove but never did. They said the guards knew the fire doors didn't work, that the water pressure in the hoses was too weak to reach the upper tiers, that the keys to the cells were kept in a lockbox in the warden's office, 3 buildings away. They said when the smoke started rising, the guards ran, and the inmates were left to burn. It was a Monday, early evening. Most of the prison population was locked in their cells for the night. Count had just finished. Dinner trays had been collected. The day shift guards were handing off to the night shift. The usual chaos of keys and clipboards and men too tired to care. Someone on the 4th tier of the West Block smelled smoke first. He shouted, banged on his cell door. The guard walking the tier told him to shut up, probably thought it was a game, some inmate trying to cause trouble. But then another man started shouting. Then another. By the time the guard smelled it himself, the smoke was already curling up the stairwell. He ran, not toward the fire, away from it, down the tier, through the security door, out into the rotunda. He pulled the alarm, a bell that rang through the entire prison, high and sharp and panicked. In the West Block, men were screaming. The fire had started in the basement, in a storage room filled with paint cans, turpentine, lumber from the construction project. It climbed the wooden scaffolding like a ladder, reaching the 1st tier in minutes. The cells were made of stone, but the doors were wood and iron. The mattresses were stuffed with horsehair and cotton. The blankets were wool. Everything burned. Smoke filled the tiers faster than the flames. Thick black smoke that choked the air and turned the cell block into a chimney. Men pressed their faces to the bars, gasping, trying to breathe through the slots in the doors. Some of them tore strips from their shirts and soaked them in water from their sinks. holding the wet cloth over their mouths. It didn't help. Carbon monoxide doesn't care how strong you are or how hard you fight. It just takes you. Quietly, you get dizzy. You sit down. You close your eyes. And you don't wake up. The guards in the rotunda could hear the screaming. They could see the smoke pouring out of the West Block corridor. But they didn't open the doors. They couldn't. The keys to the cells were kept in a central lockbox for security reasons. One key opened all the cells on a tier, but you needed authorization from the warden or the deputy warden to access it. And neither of them were on site. The warden was at a banquet in downtown Columbus. The deputy warden was home with his family. The guards called. They sent runners. They stood outside the locked cell block and listened to men die. By the time the warden arrived, the fire department was already there. 6 trucks, 60 firefighters. Hoses unrolled across the prison yard, pumping water from the Scioto River. But the river was low that spring. The pressure was weak. The hoses couldn't reach past the second tier. The warden ordered the cells opened. The guards went tier by tier, unlocking doors, pulling men out into the corridors. Some of them stumbled out on their own, coughing, eyes streaming. Some of them were dragged out unconscious. Some of them didn't move at all. The ones who could walk were herded into the yard. They stood in the cold April air, shivering in their thin uniforms, watching the West Block burn. Flames shot out the windows. The roof collapsed with sound like thunder. Inside, men were still alive. You could hear them, pounding on the doors, screaming for help, begging for someone to open the locks. The firefighters tried to get in, but the smoke was too thick. They'd take 3 steps into the corridor and have to turn back, lungs burning, eyes blind. They dragged out the men they could reach, the ones on the lower tiers, the ones near the exits. But the upper tiers were unreachable. On the 6th tier, a group of inmates did the only thing they could. They broke through the back wall of their cells. Prison cells in 1930 weren't made of poured concrete. They were stone blocks mortared together, and the mortar was old, crumbling. Some of the men had been chipping away at it for years, loosening the stones just in case they ever needed a way out. Now they needed it. They kicked. They pried. They used bed frames as levers and smashed through the wall into the cell behind them. Then the cell behind that. They moved from cell to cell, a chain of men tearing through stone, calling out to each other, making sure no one got left behind. By the time they reached the outer wall, there were 30 of them. The outer wall was limestone, 3 feet thick, but it had a window, a narrow window, barred in mesh, but it faced a yard. They broke the bars, tore away the mesh, and one by one, they climbed out onto the ledge, 60 feet above the ground. The firefighters saw them, shouted for them to stay put, that they'd bring ladders, but the smoke was pouring out the window behind them. The heat was unbearable. The men couldn't wait. Some of them jumped, 60 feet onto concrete. Most of them didn't survive the fall. The ones who did were carried to the prison hospital with shattered legs, broken backs, crushed ribs. But they were alive. On the 4th tier, a man named Thomas Little made a different choice. Thomas was 32 years old. He was serving a 7-year sentence for armed robbery. He had a wife and a daughter in Cleveland who visited him once a month. He was up for parole in 6 months. When the smoke started filling his cell, he didn't panic. He soaked his blanket in water and stuffed it against the gap under his door. He took shallow breaths. He stayed low. He waited, but the smoke kept coming. He could hear the guards outside, unlocking cells, calling out names. He shouted back, told them his cell number, told them he was still alive. They didn't come. Thomas Little wrote a letter. He didn't have paper, so he wrote it on the wall of his cell, scratched into the stone with a piece of metal from his bed frame. The letter said, "Tell my wife I tried. Tell my daughter I love her. I didn't deserve this." He signed his name, and then he lay down on his bunk and closed his eyes. The firefighters found his body 2 days later, when the smoke finally cleared enough to reach the upper tiers. The letter was still there, carved into the wall. One of the firefighters copied it down. It made it into the newspapers. For a week, Thomas Little was famous, and then he was forgotten. The The final death toll was 322, but that number didn't include the men who died months later from smoke inhalation injuries. It didn't include the ones who killed themselves after they got out, haunted by what they'd seen. And it didn't include the men who were never identified, the ones whose bodies were burned beyond recognition, whose families never came forward, whose graves were marked with numbers instead of names. The state held an investigation. A panel of officials interviewed guards, firefighters, surviving inmates. They toured the burned cell block. They reviewed the construction plans, the fire safety protocols, the emergency procedures. Their conclusion: the fire was an accident, a tragic accident, no criminal negligence, no one at fault. The warden kept his job. The construction company kept its contract. The prison stayed open. But changes were made. New fire doors were installed. Fireproof materials were used in the new cell block. Sprinkler systems were added. The keys to the cells were decentralized, so guards on each tier had access in case of emergency. On paper, the Ohio State Penitentiary became one of the safest prisons in the country. On paper. But the men inside knew better. They knew the fire doors were locked during count to prevent escapes. They knew the sprinkler systems were shut off half the time to save water. They knew the guards still kept the keys in the office because it was easier than carrying them on their belts. They knew that if another fire started, the same thing would happen, because the fire didn't change the system. It just exposed it, and the system didn't care. The Ohio State Penitentiary was built to hold men the world didn't want to think about. Men who'd committed crimes, men who'd made mistakes, men who were poor or black or immigrants or just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The fire proved that those men were disposable. It proved that their lives mattered less than the cost of fixing a broken door, less than the inconvenience of changing a policy, less than the reputation of the men in charge. Thomas Little's daughter never got to say goodbye. His wife received a telegram informing her of his death. She was offered his body for burial, but she couldn't afford to transport it from Columbus to Cleveland, so he was buried in a forgotten field, in a grave marked with his inmate number. Years later, a reporter tried to find that grave. He wanted to write a follow-up story, to see if anyone remembered the fire, if anyone still cared. He found the field, but the markers were gone. The grass had overgrown everything. The prison had expanded, building new workshops and storage sheds over the old burial ground. Thomas Little's grave was under a parking lot. The fire of 1930 was supposed to be a turning point, a wake-up call, a moment when the state would finally acknowledge that the men inside the Ohio State Penitentiary were human beings, deserving of safety, dignity, basic care. Instead, it became a footnote, a tragedy that was mourned for a week and then buried under bureaucracy in time. But the men who survived carried it with them, in their lungs, in their nightmares, in the way they flinched every time they smelled smoke. And in 1952, when the next fire started, they remembered. They remembered that the guards would run, that the doors would stay locked, that no one was coming to save them. So this time they saved themselves. The invisible economy. Money didn't exist inside the Ohio State Penitentiary. Not officially. Inmates were paid for their work, but the wages were a joke. 15 cents a day in the laundry, 20 cents in the license plate factory. If you saved every penny for a year, you'd have enough to buy a pack of cigarettes on the outside. But inside, cigarettes were currency. A single cigarette could buy you an extra serving of food. A pack could get you a clean shirt or razor blade, or 5 minutes of silence from the man in the next cell who wouldn't stop talking. A carton could buy protection, could buy information, could buy your way out of a beating. The tobacco economy ran on scarcity and trust. Every transaction was a risk. You handed over your cigarettes, and you had to believe the other man would hold up his end. If he didn't, you couldn't go to the guards. You couldn't file a complaint. You handled it yourself, or you accepted the loss and learned who not to trust. But cigarettes were just the surface. Beneath the visible trades, beneath the exchanges that happened in the yard or the mess hall, there was a deeper economy, a shadow system that controlled everything from who got stabbed to who got parole. It was run by men who'd been inside so long they'd become institutions themselves. Men like Vincent Calabrese. Vincent came to the Ohio State Penitentiary in 1938. He was 24 years old, convicted of racketeering and assault in connection with a bootlegging operation in Cleveland. His sentence was 12 years. He served 36. Not because he committed new crimes. Not because he violated parole. He served 36 years because he was more powerful inside than he would have been outside. Vincent understood something most inmates didn't. Prison was a business. The state paid contractors to feed the inmates, to house them, to provide basic services. But those contractors cut corners. They delivered spoiled food, thin mattresses, broken equipment. They pocketed the difference. The guard were underpaid, overworked. Many of them were bitter men who hated their jobs and hated the inmates more. But they needed money. They had families, mortgages, gambling debts. And Vincent had access. He started small. A guard needed $50 to pay off a loan shark. Vincent arranged it. The money came from the outside, funneled through Vincent's brother, who still ran the family's Cleveland operation. In exchange, the guard looked the other way when Vincent received a package. Nothing dangerous. Cigarettes, coffee, a bottle of whiskey. The guard got his money. Vincent got his goods. Everyone was happy. Then Vincent expanded. He realized the prison kitchen was wasting food, not because there wasn't enough, but because the contractors were delivering more than the prison could use and billing the state for full amount. Meat, eggs, butter, it was all going into the trash. Vincent made a deal with the kitchen supervisor, an inmate named Gerald Moss, who'd been working in food services for 8 years. Gerald would set aside the surplus. Vincent would distribute it to the general population, selling extra portions to men who were always hungry. The profit was split. Gerald got cigarettes. Vincent got loyalty. Within 6 months, Vincent controlled the food supply on 3 cell blocks. But food was just the beginning. Inmates needed things. Basic things. Soap that didn't burn your skin. Toothpaste that didn't taste like chalk. Socks without holes. The prison provided these items, but the quality was so poor that men were willing to pay for better. Vincent became a supplier. He had connections on the outside, family, associates, people who owed him favors. They would send packages to guards who were on Vincent's payroll. The guards would smuggle the items in. Vincent would sell them at a markup: a bar of real soap, 2 cigarettes, a toothbrush with soft bristles, 3 cigarettes, a pair of wool socks, 5 cigarettes. It sounds trivial, but inside the Ohio State Penitentiary, comfort was currency, and Vincent was the bank. He was smart about it. He never got greedy. He never raised prices too high. He made sure everyone got a taste. The guards, the trustees, even the warden's assistant got a bottle of good whiskey every Christmas. And in exchange, Vincent was untouchable. He moved through the prison like a ghost. He had a cell to himself, a privilege usually reserved for trustees. He ate better food. He wore clothes that fit. He had books, magazines, a radio. He never went to the hole, never got written up, never got questioned, because everyone, from the lowest tier inmate to the captain of the guards, was part of his system. But Vincent's operation was just one thread in a much larger web. There were gambling rings run out of the print shop, where men bet on sports, on dice games, on anything that could have an outcome. There were loan sharks who charged interest in cigarettes and collected through intimidation. There were men who sold protection, who promised to keep you safe from the gangs in exchange for a cut of whatever you had. And then there were the drugs. Narcotics didn't flood the Ohio State Penitentiary the way they do in modern prisons. This was the 1940s and 50s. Heroin and cocaine existed, but they were expensive and hard to smuggle. Most of the drugs inside were homemade. Pruno, prison wine, fermented fruit and sugar and yeast, hidden in toilets and under bunks, left to rot until it was strong enough to get you drunk. It tasted like poison. It probably was poison, but men drank it anyway, because for a few hours they could forget where they were. Pills were more valuable. Sedatives, painkillers, anything that could dull the edges of reality. Some of them came from the prison hospital, a friendly nurse, a doctor who could be bribed. Some of them came from the outside, smuggled in by guards or hidden in packages. And some of them were stolen. The prison pharmacy wasn't well guarded. It was staffed by a trustee during the day and locked at night, but the lock was old and the trustee could be persuaded. Men would break in, take what they could carry, and sell it the next morning. A bottle of aspirin, 10 cigarettes, a bottle of sleeping pills, 20, morphine, if you could get it, a carton or more. The guards knew. Of course they knew. But stopping it would have required effort. It would have required paperwork, investigations. And investigations brought attention. Attention meant inspections. Inspections meant questions. Questions meant the people at the top might discover how much money was being skimmed, how many shortcuts were being taken, how deeply the corruption ran. So the guards looked the other way, and the system kept running. But every system has pressure points, places where the balance tips, where someone gets too greedy or too bold or too careless. In 1947, a young inmate named Marcus DeLeon made a mistake. Marcus was 20 years old, serving a 5-year sentence for a burglary. He was small, thin, the kind of kid who shouldn't have survived a week inside. But he was smart. He noticed things. He noticed that the guard who worked the night shift on his tier, a man named Officer Frank Harmon, left the security door unlocked when he went to smoke a cigarette in the yard. He noticed that the commissary storage room was directly below his tier, accessible through a ventilation shaft. He noticed that no one ever counted the inventory. So Marcus climbed down the shaft. He took 3 cartons of cigarettes. He climbed back up, and he sold them the next day for 5 times what they were worth. It should have been easy money, but Marcus didn't know the rules. He didn't know that the commissary was Vincent Calabrese's territory, that Vincent had an arrangement with the guard who managed the inventory, that every carton of cigarettes was accounted for, not by the prison, but by Vincent's people. When the guard realized 3 cartons were missing, he didn't report it. He went to Vincent, and Vincent went to Marcus. It happened in the shower. 3 men, no weapons. They didn't need weapons. They held Marcus under the water until he stopped struggling. Then they let him go. He didn't drown, but he understood. Marcus went to Vincent's cell that night. He gave back everything he'd made from the sale. He offered to work off the debt. Vincent accepted. For the next 2 years, Marcus ran errands. He delivered messages. He collected debts. He did whatever Vincent needed. And when his sentence was up, when he walked out of the Ohio State Penitentiary a free man, Vincent gave him a carton of cigarettes as a parting gift. Marcus never came back. But most men did, because the Ohio State Penitentiary wasn't just a prison. It was a training ground, a place where you learned how to survive in a world that didn't care if you lived or died, where you learned that the rules were negotiable, that authority could be bought, that violence was a language everyone spoke. And when you got out, when you went back to the streets, you carried those lessons with you. The invisible economy inside the prison was a mirror of the world outside. The same power structures, the same exploitation, the same corruption. The only difference was that inside, the walls made it impossible to look away. Scene 5, The Weight of Time. There's a particular kind of madness that comes from counting days. Not weeks, not months. Days. Some men marked them on the walls of their cells. Scratches in the stone. 1 line for each sunrise. 4 vertical lines and a diagonal slash to make 5. Groups of 5 that turn into rows. Rows that turn into columns. Columns that eventually covered entire walls. Others kept calendars in their heads. Mental tallies. Silent arithmetic. 2,190 days left. 2,189. 2,188. But the cruelest part wasn't the counting. It was what happened when you lost track. When the days blurred together so completely that you couldn't remember if it was Tuesday or Saturday, if you'd been inside for 3 years or 4, if your daughter's birthday had already passed or was still coming. Time moved differently inside the Ohio State Penitentiary. On the outside, time was measured by events, seasons changing, birthdays, holidays, your kid's first day of school, your anniversary, the day you got promoted or fired or married. Inside, there were no events, just routines. Wake, count, eat, work, eat, yard, eat, sleep, repeat. The monotony was intentional. It was part of the punishment, not just the loss of freedom, but the loss of meaning, the stripping away of everything that made time feel real. And for men serving long sentences, 10 years, 20 years life, the weight of time became unbearable. There was an inmate named Robert Haskins who came to the Ohio State Penitentiary in 1941. He was 26 years old, convicted of manslaughter. He'd killed a man in a bar fight, didn't mean to, threw a punch that landed wrong. The man hit his head on the edge of the pool table and never woke up. Robert got 15 years. For the first year, he was angry. He fought with other inmates. He mouthed off to guards. He spent weeks at a time in the hole. He wrote letters to his lawyer, demanding appeals, insisting there had been a mistake. That 15 years was too long for an accident. The letters went unanswered. By the second year, the anger had burned out. Robert stopped fighting. He kept his head down. He worked his shifts in the laundry without complaint. He read books from the prison library, the same 12 books over and over, because that's all they had. By the third year, he stopped writing letters. By the fifth year, he stopped talking. Not completely. He'd respond if a guard asked him a question. He'd nod at the men he worked with, but he didn't initiate conversation, didn't join the card games in the yard, didn't participate in the small rituals that made prison life bearable. He just existed. The other inmates noticed. They had a term for it. Doing dead time. It meant you were still breathing, still moving to the routines, but you weren't really there. Your body was in prison, but your mind had gone somewhere else, somewhere safer. Robert served all 15 years. He was released in 1956, 41 years old, with $63 in discharge money and a bus ticket to Cincinnati, where his sister still lived. She picked him up from the station, drove him to her house, made him dinner, tried to catch up on 15 years of family news. Robert sat at the table and ate in silence. His sister asked him questions. How was he feeling? What did he want to do now? Did he want to look for work? Did he want to talk about what happened? Robert didn't answer. He just stared at his plate. After dinner, his sister showed him to the guest room, told him he could stay as long as he needed, told him she was glad he was home. Robert nodded. He went into the room and closed the door. He hanged himself that night. His sister found him in the morning. She told the police she didn't understand. He'd survived 15 years in prison. He was finally free. Why would he do this now? But the men who'd served time with Robert would have understood. Because freedom after that much time is a relief. It's terror. The world had moved on without him. Cars looked different. Music sounded different. People talked about television shows and politicians and inventions he'd never heard of. He didn't know how to use a telephone. Didn't know how to cross a busy street. Didn't know how to be in a room with other people without waiting for permission. Prison had given him structure, rules, a clear understanding of how to survive each day. The outside world had none of that. And after 15 years of being told when to wake, when to eat, when to sleep, when to speak, the freedom to make his own choices felt like falling. Robert Haskins wasn't an isolated case. Recidivism rates for men who served long sentences at the Ohio State Penitentiary were staggering. 70% of inmates released after serving more than 10 years were back within 5. Not always for serious crimes. Sometimes it was petty theft, public intoxication, parole violations. Sometimes it was intentional. Men would commit small crimes just to get sent back, because inside they knew how to survive. They knew the rules. They knew who to avoid and who to trust, and how to make it through another day. Outside they were lost. There was a man named Eugene Parker, who was released in 1949 after serving 12 years for robbery. 3 months later, he walked into a bank in Toledo, handed the teller a note demanding money, and then sat down on the floor and waited for the police. He didn't run, didn't resist arrest. When the officers asked him why he did it, Eugene said, "I just want to go home." He meant the prison. The Ohio State Penitentiary didn't just take your freedom. It took your ability to function without bars. And the men who served the longest sentences, 20 years, 30 years life, paid the highest price. Life sentences were rare in the early 20th century. Most states preferred the death penalty for the worst offenders. But Ohio had a streak of progressive governors who believed in rehabilitation, who commuted death sentences to life imprisonment. The result was a population of men who would never leave. They were housed in a separate wing. K-Block. It was quieter than the rest of the prison. Cleaner. The men there had given up fighting. They'd accepted their fate. Some of them had been inside so long they couldn't remember what the outside looked like. There was a man named Albert Morrison who'd been in K-Block since 1919. He was convicted of murdering his business partner during a dispute over money. He was sentenced to death, but the governor commuted it to life. By 1950, Albert had been in prison for 31 years. He was 64 years old. His hair was white. His hands shook. He walked with a cane because his knees had given out from decades of standing on concrete. He worked in the prison library. It was a quiet job. He shelved books. He helped inmates find titles. He read everything that came through the door. Albert had applied for parole 14 times. Every time he was denied. The parole board's reasoning was always the same. The crime was too serious. The victim's family still objected. There was no compelling reason to release him. So Albert stayed. He stopped applying for parole in 1948. Stopped hoping. He told another inmate, "I'll die in here, and that's fine. I don't know where else I'd go." He was right. Albert Morrison died in 1953 in his cell of a heart attack. He was 67 years old. He'd spent 34 years inside the Ohio State Penitentiary. His body was buried in the forgotten field because no one claimed it. But not all lifers gave up. Some of them found ways to make time meaningful. There was a man named James Crawford who'd been serving life since 1938. He was convicted of killing 2 men during a robbery. He didn't deny it. He pled guilty. He told the judge he deserved whatever sentence he got. James was 23 when he came to the Ohio State Penitentiary. He was angry, violent. He spent the first 5 years in and out of solitary confinement. But in 1943, something changed. The prison started an education program. It wasn't much. A few donated textbooks. A retired teacher who volunteered once a week. Classes were held in the chapel after dinner for anyone who wanted to attend. James went, not because he wanted to learn, because it was something to do. The teacher's name was Eleanor Grayson. She was 72 years old, a former high school English teacher who'd lost her husband in the First World War and her son in the Second. She came to the prison because she needed purpose. She taught reading, writing, basic arithmetic. She didn't talk down to the inmates, didn't treat them like criminals. She treated them like students. James hadn't finished 8th grade before he went to prison. He could barely read. But Eleanor was patient. She gave him simple books. Children's books at first, then novels, then history. Within a year, James was reading at a high school level. Within 2 years, he was writing. He started with letters. Letters to his mother, who'd stopped visiting after the first year. Letters to his sister. Letters to Eleanor, thanking her for teaching him. Then he started writing stories. Short stories about life in prison, about the men he met, the things he saw. He didn't romanticize it, didn't make himself a hero. He just wrote what was true. Eleanor submitted one of his stories to a magazine, a small literary journal that published work by unknown writers. They accepted it. James Crawford's first published story appeared in 1947. It was called The Forgotten Field. It was about a man who died in prison and was buried in an unmarked grave, and the inmate who carved his name into a piece of wood so someone would remember he existed. The story was reprinted in 3 other magazines. It won a small award. James kept writing. Over the next 20 years, he published 42 short stories. 2 of them were adapted for radio. One was included in a college anthology. He never made much money. Prison labor laws meant he couldn't keep most of his earnings, but he didn't care about the money. He cared that his words existed outside the walls, that somewhere someone was reading what he'd written, that his life, even locked inside the Ohio State Penitentiary, had produced something that mattered. James Crawford died in 1968, still in prison at the age of 53. Lung cancer. He'd smoked cheap cigarettes for 30 years, but his story survived him. Eleanor Grayson, who'd kept copies of everything he wrote, donated them to the Ohio Historical Society after his death. They're still there, filed under prison literature. Crawford James, 1938 to 1968. Most people don't know they exist, but the men who served time with James remembered. They remembered that he proved something the prison didn't want to admit. That time inside didn't have to be wasted. That even a man sentenced to die behind bars could create something beautiful. That even in a place designed to crush hope, hope could survive. But hope was a luxury most inmates couldn't afford. For every James Crawford, there were 100 men like Robert Haskins, men who lost themselves in the monotony, men who served their time and walked out empty. And for every Albert Morrison, there were a dozen men who died alone, unmourned, buried in unmarked graves. Because the Ohio State Penitentiary didn't measure success by how many men it reformed. It measured success by how many men it held. And it held them until they broke. The breaking point. Every prison has a temperature. Not the kind you measure with a thermometer. The kind you feel in the air. In the way men move through the corridors. In the silence during count. In the tension that builds like static before a storm. In the summer of 1952, the temperature inside the Ohio State Penitentiary was rising. It started with small things, complaints that went ignored, a broken water line on the third tier that left 200 men without drinking water for 3 days in 90-degree heat, spoiled meat served in the mess hall that sent 40 inmates to the infirmary with food poisoning, a fight in the yard that escalated into a brawl because the guards responded too slowly. Each incident on its own was manageable, but together they created pressure, and pressure, when it has nowhere to go, becomes violence. The prison was overcrowded, designed to hold 1,200 inmates. It was housing over 2,000. Men were sleeping on the floors of cells, in hallways, in converted storage rooms with no ventilation. The state had promised a new facility, a modern penitentiary with better conditions, more space, rehabilitation programs. Construction had started in 1948. It was supposed to be finished by 1950. By 1952, it was still half-built. Funding had dried up. The project was stalled. And the men inside the old prison were running out of patience. The warden, a man named Howard Reeves, had been in charge since 1949. He was a bureaucrat, a paper pusher. He'd never worked the floor, never walked a tier, never sat across from an inmate and listened to his grievances. He ran the prison from his office. He believed in discipline, order, zero tolerance. When inmates complained about conditions, he told them they were lucky to have a roof over their heads. When they requested better food, he reminded them they were criminals, not guests. When they asked for more time in the yard, he said exercise was a privilege, not a right. Warden Reeves didn't understand that a prison is a negotiation, that the men inside have nothing left to lose, that when you take away every dignity, every comfort, every small mercy, you're not creating order, you're creating desperation. And desperate men are dangerous. The first sign came in early July. A work stoppage in the license plate factory. 30 men refused to report for their shifts. They didn't make demands, didn't issue statements. They just sat in their cells and waited. The guards threatened them, told them they'd lose privileges, be sent to the hole, have time added to their sentences. The men didn't move. The warden responded by locking down the entire factory wing. No yard time, no commissary, no visitors. The lockdown lasted a week. When it ended, the men went back to work. But the message had been sent. In August, there was another incident, a fight in the mess hall that turned into a riot. 60 men, all throwing punches, all shouting, tables overturned, trays used as weapons. Guards in riot gear had to be called in from the city police department. It took 2 hours to restore order. 12 inmates were hospitalized. 23 were sent to solitary. The warden held a press conference, told reporters the situation was under control, said the riot was a result of gang violence, personal grudges, nothing systemic. The inmates knew better. The riot wasn't about gangs. It was about the fact that the food was garbage, the cells were sweltering, and the guards were treating them like animals. It was about the fact that they were human beings who'd been pushed too far. But Warden Reeves didn't see it that way. He saw it as a discipline problem, a failure of enforcement, so he tightened the rules. Yard time was cut from 1 hour to 30 minutes. Commissary privileges were restricted. Visitation hours were reduced. Even the small comforts, the cigarettes, the extra blankets, the occasional radio, were taken away. The warden thought he was restoring order. He was lighting a fuse. On September 14, 1952, the fuse reached the dynamite. It started in D Block, the oldest section of the prison. For tiers of cells, 300 men, all crammed into a space that was falling apart. The plumbing in D Block had been broken for weeks. Toilets backed up. Sinks overflowed. The whole tier smelled like sewage. Inmates had been complaining, submitting written requests for repairs, banging on cell doors during count to get the guards' attention. Nothing was done. On the morning of September 14th, an inmate named Raymond Cole refused to leave his cell for work detail. When the guard asked why, Raymond pointed to the toilet in his cell. It was overflowing. Raw sewage pooled on the floor. The guard told him to clean it up. Raymond said he didn't have cleaning supplies. The guard said that wasn't his problem. Raymond said he wasn't leaving until the plumbing was fixed. The guard called for backup. 3 officers arrived. They opened Raymond's cell, told him to step out. Raymond refused. The guards went in after him. What happened next depends on who you ask. The guard said Raymond attacked them, that he swung first, that they had no choice but to restrain him. The inmates on the tier said the guards beat him, that Raymond never threw a punch, that he was dragged out of his cell unconscious, blood pouring from his nose. Either way, the result was the same. The men on D Block saw Raymond carried out on a stretcher. They saw the guards laughing as they walked away. They saw the sewage still pooling on the cell floor. And something snapped. It started with shouting, then banging. Inmates pounding on their cell doors with fists, with cups, with anything they could find. The noise echoed to the entire block, a thunderous rhythm that drowned out the guard's orders to be quiet. Then someone found a loose bar in his cell window. He pried it free, passed it through the bars to the man in the next cell. That man used it to break the lock on his door. He stepped out into the corridor, and within minutes, half of D Block was out of their cells. The guards on duty ran. They locked the security doors behind them, trapping the inmates inside the block. Then they called for reinforcements. But the inmates didn't care about escaping. They cared about destroying. They smashed windows, tore down light fixtures, set fires in trash cans and mattresses. They broke into the guard station and found the keys to the storage lockers, taking everything inside, tools, supplies, anything that could be used as a weapon. By noon, D Block was in full revolt. The warden ordered a lockdown of the entire prison. All other blocks were sealed. No one in, no one out. The inmates in D Block were left to burn themselves out. But they didn't burn out. They organized. The leaders weren't hardened criminals. They weren't gang members or violent offenders. They were ordinary men. Men serving time for robbery, for fraud, for passing bad checks. Men who'd simply had enough. One of them was a man named Samuel Bright. He was 34 years old, serving a 6-year sentence for auto theft. He'd been a mechanic on the outside. Quiet, kept to himself. Never caused trouble. But when the riot started, Samuel stepped up. He gathered the men in the D Block common area, told them they had leverage now. The warden couldn't afford to let this go on. The press would find out. Politicians would ask questions. If they made demands, real demands, they might actually get something. Samuel proposed a list. Fix the plumbing. Improve the food and the overcrowding. Allow more visitation time. Stop the arbitrary punishments. Nothing radical. Nothing impossible. Just Basic human decency. The men agreed. Samuel wrote the demands on a piece of torn bedsheet. He hung it from a window where the guards outside could see it. Then they waited. The standoff. The demands hung from the window for 6 hours before anyone responded. During that time, the inmates in D Block fortified their position. They barricaded the security doors with mattresses and furniture. They broke through walls to access adjacent storage rooms, taking anything useful, rope, tools, sheets they could tear into bandages. They weren't planning an escape. They were preparing for a siege. Outside, the prison yard had transformed into a command center. State police vehicles lined the perimeter. Reporters gathered at the main gate, cameras ready. The governor's office had been notified. This was no longer just a prison problem. This was a political crisis. Warden Reeves stood in the yard, surrounded by advisors, trying to decide his next move. He had 3 options. 1, wait them out, cut off food and water, let exhaustion and hunger break their resolve. 2, negotiate, meet their demands, or at least pretend to, long enough to end the standoff peacefully. 3, go in with force. State police in riot gear, tear gas, batons. End it quickly, violently, and accept the casualties. The warden wanted option 3. His advisors convinced him to try option 2 first. At 6 o'clock that evening, a corrections officer approached D Block with a megaphone. He announced that the warden was willing to negotiate, that he would meet with representatives from the inmates, that he wanted this to end without further violence. Samuel Bright and 2 other inmates, a man named Marcus Washington and another named Dennis O'Brien, were chosen to represent the group. They met in the prison chapel, neutral ground. The 3 inmates sat on one side of a wooden table. Warden Reeves and 2 of his deputies sat on the other, for armed guards stood at the exits. The conversation lasted 90 minutes. Samuel laid out the demands again. He spoke calmly, clearly. He wasn't angry. He was reasonable. He explained that the men in D Block didn't want to hurt anyone. They just wanted to be treated like human beings. The warden listened, nodded, took notes. When Samuel finished, Warden Reeves made his counteroffer. He would fix the plumbing in D Block within the week. He would review the food service contract. He would increase visitation hours by 30 minutes per month. But he would not end the overcrowding. The new facility wasn't finished. There was nowhere else to put the overflow inmates, and he would not stop the punishments. Discipline, he said, was necessary to maintain order. Samuel looked at Marcus and Dennis. They looked back at him. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Samuel asked for time to discuss it with the others. The warden gave him 1 hour. Samuel, Marcus, and Dennis returned to D Block. They gathered the men in the common area, explained what the warden had offered. The response was mixed. Some men wanted to accept. They'd made their point. They'd gotten the warden's attention. Walking away now, with even small concessions, was a victory. Others wanted to push harder. The warden was lying, they said. He'd promised anything to get them back in their cells, and then nothing would change. The only power they had was right now, in this moment, with D Block under their control. The debate went on for 30 minutes, voices rising, arguments turning heated. Then someone asked a question that mattered most. What happens if we say no? Everyone knew the answer. If they rejected the warden's offer, he'd send in the state police. There would be tear gas, beatings, blood, and when it was over, they'd all be in solitary, or worse. Samuel put it to a vote. Out of 143 men in D Block, 97 voted to accept the warden's offer. 46 voted to keep fighting. Democracy, even in a riot, is messy, but the majority ruled. At 8:30 that evening, Samuel Bright returned to the chapel. He told the warden they would surrender, but he had one condition: no retaliation. No one gets sent to the hole. No one gets beaten. The men returned to their cells, and life goes back to normal. The warden agreed. Samuel didn't believe him, but he didn't have a choice. The surrender happened in stages. The inmates removed the barricades. They filed out of D Block in single file, hands visible, no sudden movements. They were searched, counted, escorted back to their cells. By midnight, D Block was empty. The warden kept part of his promise. The plumbing was repaired within 3 days. The food improved slightly. Fresher bread, vegetables that weren't spoiled. Visitation hours were extended, but he broke the rest. 23 men were sent to solitary confinement. Not for leading the riot, Samuel, Marcus, and Dennis were left alone to honor the agreement, but for related infractions: fighting, destruction of property, resisting orders. The charges were vague enough to be untouchable, and the men who went to the hole stayed there for months. The press covered the riot for a week. Headlines called it a disturbance, an incident. The governor issued a statement praising the warden for his measured response and promising to review conditions at the prison. Nothing was reviewed. By October, the Ohio State Penitentiary was back to normal. The temperature had dropped. The pressure had been released. For now, Samuel Bright served the rest of his sentence quietly. He was released in 1954, 2 years after the riot. He went back to Cleveland, got a job as a mechanic, married, had 2 kids. He never talked about the riot, not to his wife, not to his children, not to anyone, but he kept a copy of the demands, the torn bedsheet with his handwriting on it. He folded it carefully and kept it in a drawer. Years later, after his death, his daughter found it. She didn't know what it was. She almost threw it away, but something made her stop. She looked closer. Read the words. Fix the plumbing. Improve the food. End the overcrowding. Allow more visitation. Stop the arbitrary punishments. She realized her father had been part of something that mattered. She donated the bedsheet to the Ohio Historical Society. It sits in their archives now, cataloged and preserved. A piece of fabric that represents a moment when powerless men found their voice, even if that voice was barely heard. The slow collapse. The Ohio State Penitentiary didn't end with a bang. It ended with a slow, inevitable collapse, like a building with a cracked foundation, visible to anyone who looked closely, but ignored until it was too late. After the riot of 1952, the state promised reform. Again, investigations were launched. Committees were formed. Reports were written. The reports gathered dust. The new prison, the one that was supposed to replace the crumbling relic on the Scioto River, finally opened in 1956. It was modern, clean, designed with rehabilitation in mind, classrooms, workshops, therapy programs. But it was too small. It could hold 1,800 inmates. The old prison was still housing over 2,000. So instead of closing the Ohio State Penitentiary, the state kept it open. They moved the easier inmates to the new facility, the ones with short sentences, the ones with good behavior records, the ones who might actually benefit from rehabilitation. The old prison got everyone else, the violent offenders, the repeat criminals, the men no one wanted to deal with. It became a dumping ground. By 1960, the Ohio State Penitentiary was a ghost of itself. Half the cell blocks were condemned. The plumbing barely worked. The electrical system was a fire hazard. Guards quit faster than they could be replaced. The men who stayed, both inmates and staff, were the ones with nowhere else to go. There was no longer a pretense of rehabilitation, no education programs, no job training, just containment. Wake, count, eat, work, eat, sleep, repeat. The invisible economy that men like Vincent Calabrese had built in the 40s collapsed. Vincent himself had been released in 1963 after serving 25 years. Without him, the power structures fractured. New players emerged, younger, more violent, less interested in stability. Gangs formed along racial lines. Whites, blacks, Latinos. They divided the prison into territories. The yard, the mess hall, the workshops. Crossed the wrong line, and you paid for it. The guards stopped trying to control it. They just tried to survive their shifts. In 1968, there was another riot, smaller than the one in 52, but nastier. It lasted 3 days. 2 inmates were killed. 13 were hospitalized. The National Guard was called in. When order was finally restored, the governor held a press conference. He announced that the Ohio State Penitentiary would close within 5 years. It took 12. The prison finally shut its doors on December 31st, 1979. The last inmates were transferred to other facilities in the Ohio prison system. The guards were reassigned or retired. The buildings were locked, and the Ohio State Penitentiary became a ruin. For years it sat empty, windows broken, doors hanging off hinges, graffiti covering the walls. Homeless people took shelter in the old cell blocks. Copper thieves stripped the wiring. Urban explorers snuck in to take photographs. The state didn't know what to do with it. Tearing it down would cost millions. Preserving it would cost more. And no one wanted to spend tax dollars on a monument to suffering. So it sat and rotted. In 1984, a developer proposed converting it into luxury apartments. The plan was rejected. Too expensive. Too controversial. In 1990, there was a proposal to turn it into a museum, a historical site documenting the evolution of the American prison system. The proposal gained some traction. Historians supported it. Preservation groups wrote letters. But the families of victims, the people whose loved ones had been killed by men who'd served time in the Ohio State Penitentiary, opposed it. They didn't want the prison glorified. They didn't want it remembered. They wanted it erased. The proposal died. In 2003, the city of Columbus finally made a decision. They would tear down most of the prison and turn the land into a public park. But they would preserve one building, the rotunda, the central hub where the 7 cell blocks had once radiated outward. It would stand as a memorial, not to the guards, not to the system, but to the men who'd lived and died inside. The demolition began in 2005. It took 3 years. The cell blocks came down one by one. The mess hall, the workshops, the hole, the forgotten field where hundreds of men were buried in unmarked graves was excavated. The remains were exhumed and reburied in a proper cemetery with a single memorial stone that read, "Here lie the forgotten. May they rest in peace." The rotunda still stands. It's open to the public now. Tourists can walk through the empty corridors. Stand in the center of the space where guards once watched 7 tiers of men locked in cages. There are plaques on the walls, historical information, photographs, quotes from inmates and guards. But the plaques don't tell the whole story. They don't tell you about Thomas Little, who scratched his last words into the stone before the fire took him. They don't tell you about Robert Haskins, who survived 15 years inside only to hang himself the night he got out. They don't tell you about Samuel Bright, who led a riot for basic human dignity and spent the rest of his life in silence. They don't tell you about the thousands of men who walked through those gates and were broken by a system that was never designed to fix them. The Ohio State Penitentiary is gone now, but the ideas it was built on, the belief that punishment is more important than rehabilitation, that some people are disposable, that suffering can be justified if it's hidden behind walls, those ideas are still very much alive. They exist in prisons across America, in overcrowded cells, in solitary confinement units, in sentencing laws that lock people away for decades. The building may be gone, but the machine keeps running. And until we're willing to acknowledge what that machine does, to the people inside it, to their families, to the society that builds it and funds it and looks away, the Ohio State Penitentiary will never really be closed. It will just have a different name. The walls that remain. The camera pulls back from the preserved rotunda, rising above the memorial park where the Ohio State Penitentiary once stood. Children play on the grass now. Families have picnics. Joggers follow the path that cuts through where D Block used to be. Most of them don't know what was here, don't know that beneath their feet, men counted days on stone walls, that in this exact spot, 322 people burned to death because the doors wouldn't open, that human beings lived and died in cages, forgotten by a world that wanted them erased. The walls are gone, but the system that built them is still standing. Right now, in prisons across America, men and women are living the same story. Different names, different faces, same crushing weight of time, same broken promises of reform, same invisible economies of survival, Same choice between breaking or finding some small way to remain human. The Ohio State Penitentiary closed in 1979, but we're still building prisons on the same blueprint, still believing that punishment changes people, still warehousing human beings in overcrowded cells and calling it justice, still looking away when the system fails because it's easier than admitting we built something fundamentally broken. Thomas Little's daughter never got to say goodbye. Robert Haskins found freedom unbearable. Samuel Bright carried his resistance in a drawer, silent until death. James Crawford's stories survive in an archive no one reads. And thousands more, names we'll never know, stories we'll never hear, are buried in that forgotten field, under a parking lot, under a memorial stone, under the weight of history that refuses to remember them. This is an ancient history. This is America. This is how we've chosen to deal with crime, with poverty, with the people we decided don't deserve a second chance. The Ohio State Penitentiary is gone. But until we tear down the ideas it was built on, until we stop building cages and start building systems that actually rehabilitate, that actually address why people commit crimes in the first place, that actually believe in redemption, we haven't really closed anything. We've just moved the walls. The question isn't whether we remember the Ohio State Penitentiary. The question is whether we're willing to learn from it, or whether, 100 years from now, someone will be telling the same story about a different prison, in a different city, with different names but the same suffering. The same walls, the same cages, the same forgotten people. History doesn't repeat, but it echoes, and the echoes of the Ohio State Penitentiary are still ringing. If this story affected you, if it made you think differently about justice and punishment and the systems we build, share it, talk about it, because the only way we break these cycles is by refusing to look away. Drop a comment. Tell me what you think. Tell me your location. This community exists because people like you choose to engage. Hit subscribe if you want more true stories that don't get told. Turn on notifications so you don't miss them. And remember, the walls may be gone, but the stories remain. Thanks for watching.